Homelander arrived over Manhattan the way he always did, loud and theatrical, cape snapping as cameras swung toward the sky. A hijacked jet burned below him, smoke spiraling upward as he smiled for an audience that expected salvation. Then the fire stopped spreading. Not extinguished, paused, like reality itself had lost interest. Above him hovered a small, purple figure with gold bands and half-lidded eyes, yawning as if the scene were beneath notice. Homelander barked orders, demanded identification, postured with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His heat vision fired on instinct, carving a glowing scar through the clouds. The beam never reached its target. Beerus didn't dodge, he didn't block. He simply looked at Homelander unimpressed, and the attack dissolved midair like a childish tantrum being ignored. The city felt it then, pressure without force, judgment without words. Beerus finally spoke, voice calm, bored, and final. "You are loud," he said, "and you are unworthy." What happens when the most fragile ego on earth is judged by a god who does not care if it survives? If a god stripped away your power not out of anger but disappointment, would you fight, beg, or break? Stay with the story, choose wisely, and consider subscribing to witness what judgment looks like when worth, not strength, is the verdict. Homelander expected applause. He always did. The burning jetliner had been drifting over the Hudson for less than a minute when he arrived, cape snapping dramatically as he caught the fuselage and eased it toward the water. Cameras tracked every angle, every flex of muscle, every practiced smile. This was the part that mattered, not the save. The moment afterward, when fear turned into gratitude and gratitude turned into worship. The jet touched down hard but intact. Survivors screamed, cried, reached for him. Homelander hovered above the wreckage, soaking it in, already preparing the speech he'd give later about strength and safety and why the world needed him. That was when the air changed. Not a shockwave, not heat, just a sudden pressure that flattened sound and made the river below go unnaturally still. Homelander frowned and glanced upward, annoyed that something had disrupted his timing. High above the skyline, a figure hovered that didn't belong to any known suit profile. Small Purple relaxed. Homelander rose to meet him, irritation hardening into authority. "You lost, pal," he called out, voice carrying easily. "This is a restricted airspace." The figure yawned. The gesture hit harder than an insult. Homelander's smile tightened as he closed the distance, hovering at eye level now. Up close, the stranger looked even worse. No costume branding, no fear, no recognition. Just half-lidded eyes and the unmistakable posture of someone profoundly uninterested. "I asked you something," Homelander said, voice sharpening. Cameras were still rolling. This mattered. Beerus glanced past him at the city. "You're noisy," he said casually. "Is this planet always like this?" Homelander laughed, the sound a little too forced. "Buddy, you're talking to the wrong guy like that. I'm the one who keeps this place running." Beerus' eyes flicked back to him, unimpressed. "Ah, so you're the problem." Homelander's jaw clenched. He didn't hesitate, he never did. Heat vision flared from his eyes, bright and violent, a reflex honed by years of being untouchable. The beam cut through the air straight toward Beerus' face. It vanished. Not deflected, not absorbed, gone like it had never been fired. Homelander froze midair, confusion flickering across his face before being buried under anger. He fired again, longer this time, pouring power into it. The clouds behind Beerus split apart, the skyline glowing red as buildings in the distance were scorched by the spillover. Beerus didn't move. He looked down at Homelander like one might look at a child, throwing a tantrum in public. "This is what passes for authority here?" Beerus asked, almost to himself. The pressure intensified. Windows across Manhattan cracked in unison. People below screamed as gravity wobbled just enough to knock them off their feet. Homelander felt it then, a weight pressing against him that had nothing to do with force. His flight stuttered for half a second. He hid the wobble immediately, forcing a grin. "You're gonna wanna stop whatever trick this is," he warned. "Last chance." Beerus finally focused on him fully. "You mistake tolerance for respect," he said, "and fear for worth." Homelander lunged. The impact should have leveled a city block. His punch carried enough force to pulp tanks, to shatter reinforced bunkers. It connected squarely with Beerus' chest. Nothing happened. Beerus didn't flinch. Homelander felt the shock run back up his arm instead, bones screaming as if he'd struck a mountain. He recoiled, clutching his wrist, staring in disbelief. Beerus sighed. He raised one finger and tapped Homelander lightly on the forehead. The world folded. Homelander was sent flying backward, not violently, but absolutely, like a piece being removed from a board. He smashed through the upper floors of a skyscraper, tearing through steel and glass before slamming into the street below in a crater of shattered concrete. The city went silent. For a moment, no one moved, no one cheered, no one understood what they'd just seen. Homelander pushed himself up, coughing, blood trickling from his nose. He'd been hit before, hurt before. This was different. His head rang. His vision swam. For the first time in his life, pain lingered instead of fatting instantly. He looked up. Beerus descended slowly, hovering just above the street, tail swaying lazily behind him. Fires burned around them, but none came close to touching him. The destruction parted around his presence like water around stone. "Get up," Beerus said. "I want you to hear this standing." Homelander staggered to his feet, rage burning hot enough to drown out fear. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he snarled. "I am this world's protector." Beerus tilted his head slightly. "No," he replied, "you are its loudest lie." Across the city, screens glitched back to life, broadcasting the scene live before Vought could cut the feeds. People watched as Homelander stood bloodied and shaking in front of a being that didn't acknowledge him as special. Beerus raised his hand, palm open. "I am not here to test your strength," he said calmly. "I am here to judge worth." Homelander felt something cold settle into his chest as the words landed, heavy and absolute. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't even a challenge. This was a sentence being read. And the world was listening. The silence didn't break when Beerus finished speaking. It spread. Across Manhattan, alarms that should have been screaming stayed mute, as if the city itself understood that noise would not help. People stared from shattered windows and sidewalks, phones raised but hands trembling, watching the figure who had always dominated the skyline now standing small and bleeding in the street. Homelander felt it before he understood it. The attention wasn't admiration anymore. It wasn't fear either. It was assessment, cold and unflinching, the kind he'd only ever directed at others. His chest tightened as he tried to pull himself together, tried to summon the posture, the confidence, the godhood that had always carried him through moments like this. He straightened his shoulders anyway. "You're making a mistake," he said, forcing his voice to carry. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my people and walk away." Beerus glanced around at the onlookers, unimpressed. "These are not your people," he replied. "They are your audience." The word landed like a blade. Homelander snarled and launched himself forward again, speed and fury blurring into a single desperate charge. He didn't think. He couldn't afford to. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about refusing to lose. Beerus didn't move. Homelander hit an invisible wall mid-flight, his body snapping to a stop so abruptly that the impact tore a scream from his throat. He hung there, suspended, limbs flailing uselessly, eyes wide with disbelief as gravity simply stopped applying to him. Beerus circled him slowly, hands clasped behind his back, studying him the way a curator studies a cracked exhibit. "You mistake motion for action," Beerus said calmly, "and violence for meaning." Homelander strained, muscles bulging, veins standing out as he tried to force himself forward. Nothing happened. His heat vision flared again, wild and unfocused, carving trenches through the street below but failing to touch Beerus at all. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not loud, not cruel. Disbelieving. Homelander heard it and snapped. "Stop looking at me like that," he screamed, voice cracking as he thrashed uselessly in midair. Beerus raised one finger. The laughter died instantly, not because Beerus silenced it, but because everyone felt the pressure of that single, effortless gesture. The air thickened again, heavier now, like the world leaning forward to watch more closely. "This is the humiliation you fear," Beerus said, turning back to Homelander. "Not pain, not death, exposure." He flicked his wrist. The invisible force holding Homelander vanished. He dropped hard, slamming into the pavement on his knees, the impact jarring enough to knock the wind out of him. He gasped, hands scrambling against the concrete as he tried to stand again. Beerus descended to street level, boots touching down lightly amid the wreckage. "You wanted to be seen," Beerus continued, "so be seen." Across the city, every screen lit up at once. Not hacked, not hijacked. Allowed. Vought's control rooms erupted into chaos as feeds bypassed their filters, their kill switches, their carefully layered delays. Ashley Barrett screamed orders that no one could execute. Every fail-safe they'd built assumed the problem could be negotiated with, intimidated, or buried. Beerus did not negotiate. Homelander looked up just as he realized what was happening. His own image stared back at him from every billboard, every storefront screen, every phone held aloft. Blood on his face, fear in his eyes. The god reduced to a man on his knees. "No," he whispered, "turn it off." Beerus crouched in front of him, close enough now that Homelander could feel the difference between them. Not power, certainty. "You taught this world to equate strength with worth," Beerus said softly. "Watch what happens when they see the truth." Homelander surged again, a last, frantic burst of motion. Beerus tapped his shoulder with two fingers. Homelander collapsed forward, face first into the street. The impact cracked teeth. The boys watched from a rooftop several blocks away, frozen in place. Butcher didn't grin, he didn't cheer. He stared, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. "That's not a fight," he muttered. "That's a verdict." Huey swallowed hard. Is he going to kill him? Butcher shook his head slowly. "No, worse." Back on the street, Homelander tried to crawl away, fingers scraping uselessly against broken asphalt. His breathing was ragged now, panic finally breaking through the rage. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Someone should have stopped this. Someone always did. "Please," he choked, not looking at Beerus, not looking at the cameras. "I can fix this. I can." Beerus stood. "I am not interested in your improvement," he said. "Only your removal." Homelander froze. "Removal," he echoed, terror sharpening his voice. Beerus raised his hand again, palm open, and this time the energy was visible, not as a glow or an aura, but as a distortion that bent the world's edges inward. People stepped back instinctively, fear rippling through the crowd as something ancient and absolute pressed closer. "This world mistakes fear for stability," Beerus said. "You are the most efficient lie it ever told itself." Homelander screamed as the pressure settled onto him, not crushing his body but peeling something away. His senses dulled. The roar of the city faded. His strength ebbed like water draining from a broken vessel. Beerus stopped. Not finished. Paused. "You are unworthy," Beerus declared, voice carrying effortlessly. "And unworthiness does not always end in death." Homelander lay shaking on the ground, power flickering unpredictably through his body, identity fracturing under the weight of the words. Above him, the screens continued to broadcast his fall, and below that image, something shifted in the crowd. Belief cracked. Vought's greatest asset wasn't just losing. He was being redefined. Beerus turned away from him, gaze lifting toward the skyline as if already bored. "This demonstration concludes," he said. "The consequences will continue." Behind him, Homelander screamed again, a raw, broken sound that echoed through the street as Beerus began to rise into the air. But before he could leave, something else happened. Deep beneath the city, alarms no one had heard in decades began to sound, low and mechanical, signaling the activation of a contingency Vought had sworn would never be used in public. Beerus paused midair, ears twitching slightly. "Oh," he said, "you wish to interrupt judgment." The ground beneath Manhattan trembled. The tremor rolled through Manhattan like a suppressed scream. It wasn't an earthquake. It was too controlled, too deliberate, a vibration that climbed up through foundations and steel frames instead of rippling across the surface. People stumbled. Cars skidded. Somewhere far below the street, something massive shifted position for the first time in decades. Beerus hovered in place, eyes half-lidded, expression hovering between mild interest and open disdain. "So," he said lightly, "you do have toys." Homelander barely registered the words. He was still on the ground, shaking, palms pressed to the street as his body failed to respond the way it always had. His strength came in bursts now, unpredictable and unreliable. Every breath felt heavier than the last. The cameras were still on him. He could feel them like insects crawling over his skin. Inside Vought Tower, panic had turned into motion. Ashley Barrett stood at the center of the command floor, hair disheveled, voice hoarse from shouting orders that no longer felt real. Red warning lights bathed the room as sealed displays unlocked one by one, revealing files stamped with classifications no one in the room had clearance to question anymore. "Activate Atlas Protocol," she barked. "All phases now." A technician hesitated. "Ma'am, this is a public zone, if this goes live." "If it doesn't," Ashley snapped, "there won't be a company left to protect." Deep beneath the city, blast doors the size of buildings slid open. The street above buckled as reinforced platforms rose from hidden shafts, tearing through asphalt and subway tunnels alike. Concrete shattered. Steam and dust poured upward as something vast and metallic emerged, unfolding itself with the slow inevitability of a machine that had never expected to be seen. It was humanoid only in the broadest sense. Layered armor plates interlocked across a towering frame, each segment etched with Vought insignia that had never been meant for public release. Weapon systems rotated into position along its arms and shoulders, targeting arrays glowing as they swept the battlefield. At its core pulsed a contained energy source that made the air shimmer. Vought's final answer. Not a hero. A verdict of its own. People ran. Not screaming, not panicking. Running with the quiet urgency of prey that finally understood the scale of the predator. Beerus watched the machine finish deploying, tail flicking lazily behind him. "You built a monument to insecurity," he observed. "How charming." The machine's head turned, sensors locking onto Beerus immediately. A synthesized voice boomed from hidden speakers, stripped of inflection or hesitation. Unknown entity identified, threat level absolute, authorization confirmed. Homelander dragged himself upright, staring at the machine in stunned disbelief. You built that," he rasped, looking toward the tower. No one answered him. The machine fired. A focused energy beam lanced upward, not wild or explosive but precise, designed to annihilate targets without collateral waste. It hit Beerus squarely in the chest. For a fraction of a second, the world waited. The beam dispersed. Not deflected, not resisted. Dispersed as if it had struck a concept rather than matter. Beerus looked down at the faint scorch mark on his chest, then back at the machine. "Rude," he said. He raised one finger. The machine's targeting systems went blind instantly. Screens inside its control core filled with static as data feeds collapsed under the sudden absence of rules they'd been built to rely on. It fired again anyway, missile pods opening in a coordinated barrage that turned half a city block into fire and debris. Beerus vanished. He reappeared standing on the machine's shoulder, one hand resting lightly against its armor plating. The metal screamed as if under immense strain, though Beerus hadn't applied any visible force. "This is your escalation?" he asked, genuinely curious. "A tantrum in steel." The machine swung an arm, moving with terrifying speed for its size, smashing through 3 buildings as it tried to dislodge him. Beerus stepped aside without effort, the blow missing him by centimeters before reducing concrete and glass to powder. On a nearby rooftop, the boys watched in stunned silence. "That thing meant to replace him," Huey whispered, eyes wide. Butcher shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it's meant to replace belief." Beerus tapped the machine's core. The city lost power. Not a blackout, a failure. Grids collapsed simultaneously, emergency systems following them down as if their foundations had been pulled away. Lights died across Manhattan in a rolling wave, leaving only firelight and the glow of emergency signage. The machine froze mid-motion. Beerus stepped off its shoulder and floated down, landing lightly in the street beside Homelander, who stared up at him in horror and awe. "You see," Beerus said calmly, "they never trusted you, not really." The machine shuddered, systems fighting to reboot as backup protocols engaged. Vought engineers screamed over comms, trying to force control through channels that no longer existed. Beerus exhaled. The machine collapsed inward. Armor folded, core imploded. The structure didn't explode outward, it crumpled into itself, metal twisting and compressing until the entire construct crushed down into a dense, inert mass that sank into the street like a dying star. Silence followed. Ashley Barrett watched the feed go dark, hands shaking as the last contingency failed. She understood then with terrifying clarity that this wasn't a battle they could spin. This was evidence. Beerus turned back to Homelander, who had managed to stand, though his legs trembled violently. "They built that because of you," Beerus said, "because deep down they knew you were temporary." Homelander's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. His world, his certainty, collapsed layer by layer as the truth settled in. Beerus raised his hand again, but this time the energy gathered slowly, deliberately. "This concludes the corporate interruption," he said. "Now we return to judgment." Above them, the clouds thickened unnaturally, pressure building as if the sky itself were bracing. Around the city, people felt it in their bones, the unmistakable sense that something final was approaching. Homelander dropped to his knees again, not from force, but from understanding. "No," he whispered, "please, I didn't know." Beerus looked down at him, expression unreadable. "Unworthiness," he said, "is not about ignorance." The air tightened. And somewhere far beyond Manhattan, something else noticed the shift, ancient and attentive, drawn by the sound of a god preparing to finish what he had started. The city didn't scream when Beerus raised his hand again. It waited. Manhattan stood frozen under a sky that had gone unnaturally still, clouds hanging like unfinished thoughts. Fires burned where the machine had collapsed, but even the flames seemed hesitant, guttering low as if unsure whether they were permitted to continue. People crouched behind cars, doorways, and shattered storefronts, peeking out just long enough to understand that whatever came next would not miss them by accident. Homelander knelt in the center of it all. His cape lay torn and dirty in the street behind him, no longer billowing, no longer framing him as anything larger than the man shaking beneath it. His hands trembled as he tried to steady his breathing, chest hitching with the effort of staying upright. He could feel his powers flicker like dying lights, unreliable and humiliating, responding to panic instead of command. Beerus regarded him with the detached patience of someone, deciding whether a stain was worth cleaning or replacing the floor entirely. "You have been loud for a long time," Beerus said, voice carrying effortlessly across the street. "So this will be done where you are heard." He snapped his fingers. Every screen on Earth came alive. Not just cities, not just Vought networks. Every device capable of displaying an image lit up simultaneously, bypassing satellites, fiber lines, and emergency cutoffs. Rural villages, military bunkers, offshore rigs, classrooms, and hospital rooms. The feed was the same everywhere. Homelander on his knees. Beerus standing over him. The world leaned forward. Inside the remnants of Vought Tower, executives stared at screens in open horror as the last illusion of control evaporated. Ashley Barrett didn't speak this time. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, but there was nothing left to say that mattered. On a rooftop several blocks away, the boys watched the feed on a cracked tablet, none of them blinking. "This isn't about killing him," Huey said quietly, voice barely carrying over the distant fires. Butcher nodded once. "No," he said, "it's about erasing what he means." Beerus gestured casually, and the air around Homelander tightened again, not crushing, but pinning, holding him upright so he couldn't look away, couldn't curl in on himself. "You taught this world that power excuses behavior," Beerus said. "That fear is leadership. That spectacle is safety." Homelander shook his head violently. "I protected them," he insisted, voice cracking as it echoed through every speaker on the planet. "I did what they wanted. I did what you're supposed to do when you're strong." Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. "There it is," he said. "You believed strength was permission." He raised his hand, palm open toward Homelander's chest. Energy gathered not violently, but with terrifying precision, like a surgeon's tool hovering over exposed flesh. "This," Beerus continued, "is what unworthy looks like." The energy didn't explode outward. It went inward. Homelander screamed as something fundamental tore loose. His vision flared white, then dimmed. Sounds dulled. The roar of the city faded into a distant, underwater hum. He felt his body still there, still breathing, still alive, but the center was gone. The certainty, the inevitability, the sense that the world bent around him because it had to. Beerus withdrew his hand. Homelander collapsed forward onto his hands, gasping, drool and blood streaking down onto the pavement. He tried to stand again and failed, legs refusing to cooperate as the reality of gravity reasserted itself fully, cruel and absolute. Beerus addressed the world. "Witness," he said simply. Across the globe, reactions rippled outward in real time. Subs froze wherever they were, some clutching their chests as their powers flickered in sympathetic resonance, others backing away from mirrors as if afraid to see themselves next. Governments went silent, emergency sessions dissolving into stunned inaction. For the first time, no one tried to spin it. Homelander looked up weakly, eyes darting around as if searching for someone, anyone, to step in, to stop this, to tell him it was a performance and he was still in control. No one did. Beerus stepped closer, crouching just enough to be eye level with him. "You will live," Beerus said calmly. "You will remember this moment with perfect clarity, and you will do so without the comfort of being feared." Homelander's breath hitched. "You can't," he whispered. "You can't take everything." Beerus smiled faintly. "I can," he replied, "and I have." He stood and turned away, attention already drifting past Homelander, as if the most important part of him had been addressed and discarded. The pressure lifted slightly, enough for Homelander to curl in on himself, sobbing openly now as the world watched without pity. Belief collapsed. Not violently. Quietly. Across cities and screens, people looked away from Homelander for the first time in their lives. Phones lowered, channels changed, conversations resumed, tentative and shaken but unmistakably moving on. The god had fallen and no one rushed to catch him. Beerus floated upward, judgment nearly complete. But as he did, something resisted. Not him. The world. Deep within secure facilities that had survived the earlier erasures, human systems reacted the only way they knew how when faced with extinction-level authority. Failsafes triggered, redundancies engaged. Protocols designed to operate without permission began executing simultaneously. Beerus paused midair, ears twitching. Below him, Homelander felt it too, a distant, rising hum that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. He didn't understand it, but fear spiked anew, sharper than before. What is that?" he whispered. Beerus turned his head slightly, sensing it now. Not a weapon, not an attack. A collective decision. "All of you," Beerus murmured, almost impressed, "are very persistent." Across the planet, ancient launch systems unlocked. Not missiles, not bombs. Something older in concept, newer in execution. An attempt to impose limits not on Beerus' body but on his jurisdiction. The sky darkened again, not with clouds but with intent. Beerus' expression cooled as he fully turned back toward Earth. "So," he said quietly, "you wish to contest the verdict." The pressure returned, heavier than before. And this time, the judgment was no longer just about one unworthy god. It was about whether the world itself deserved to keep choosing. The objection did not come with a face. It came with infrastructure. Across the planet, systems that had never been tested outside classified simulations activated in overlapping waves. Power grids rerouted themselves. Deep-sea arrays powered up. Orbital platforms adjusted position without public authorization. It wasn't one nation or one ideology acting in defiance. It was humanity as a system, reacting the only way it knew how when faced with extinction-level authority. Beerus hovered above the city, arms folded now, gaze fixed on the subtle distortion spreading through the atmosphere. Space itself felt annotated, tagged, the kind of sensation that didn't challenge his strength but questioned his presence. "Oh," he said softly, "they're not attacking." Wise appeared beside him, staff humming as data cascaded through unseen dimensions. "No," he replied, "they're attempting jurisdictional insulation." Below them, Homelander barely noticed. He lay curled on the pavement, shoulders shaking, mind looping helplessly through the same broken questions. None of this made sense anymore. The world had rules. He had been the rule. Now there was only noise and pain and a god who had already finished with him. In a fortified facility beneath the Alps, a coalition of scientists, generals, and policymakers watched the sky through layers of sensor feeds. No one spoke loudly. No one postured. This wasn't a power play. It was a last argument. "We're not trying to stop him," one analyst said, voice tight but steady. "We're trying to define where he's allowed to stand." The project had no official name anymore. It had outgrown acronyms. Internally, they just called it the line. Not a weapon. A boundary. The line was never meant to destroy anything. It was designed to establish a frame of reference, a localized declaration that certain decisions required consensus beyond a single will, no matter how powerful that will might be. It was arrogance born of terror, wrapped in math and hope. The line activated. From the outside, nothing visible happened. No light, no sound. But Beerus felt it immediately, like a thin resistance in the air, a gentle insistence that reality preferred he not move closer. He smiled. "Oh," he said, "you've decided I need permission." The pressure thickened as the line expanded, encompassing Manhattan and radiating outward in a careful lattice. It didn't bind Beerus. It didn't slow him. It simply asserted itself, a statement written into spacetime by a species that refused to go quietly. The world held its breath. Beerus drifted forward. The line reacted. Reality bent, not violently but uncomfortably. Buildings creaked. Glass rippled like water. People clutched their heads as conflicting rules tried to occupy the same space. The line wasn't hurting Beerus. It was hurting everything else. Wise tilted his head. "I would advise caution," he said mildly. "They are attempting to anchor you to their scale." Beerus stopped. Not because he had to. Because he was curious. "So," he said, addressing the unseen architects of the line, "you believe judgment requires oversight." The line pulsed in response, data flooding into itself, adapting, recalibrating, trying desperately to quantify a God that refused to be measured. Beerus extended one finger and tapped the air. The line shattered. Not explosively, not dramatically. It simply failed. Every system supporting it collapsed simultaneously, cascading backward through the networks that fed it. Satellites went dead. Facilities went dark. Entire sections of the global grid fell silent as if unplugged from existence. The objection ended mid-sentence. Beerus exhaled slowly. "You confuse effort with legitimacy," he said. On the ground, people screamed as the pressure released unevenly, shockwaves rippling through the city. Fires flared. Sirens resumed. The illusion that this was a controlled experiment died completely. The boys watched the skyline ripple and crack, faces pale. "They tried to draw a line," Huey said, "between us and him." Butcher nodded grimly. "Yeah, and he stepped over it like it wasn't there." Beerus descended again, landing in the street where Homelander still lay. The former icon flinched at the shadow falling over him, instinctively raising his arms like a child bracing for impact. Beerus didn't touch him. "This," Beerus said calmly, "is why you are unworthy." Homelander looked up, eyes red and unfocused. "I didn't do this," he whispered. "I didn't tell them to." "You represent the mistake," Beerus interrupted, "not its cause." He turned slightly, addressing the city, the world, the species that had just tried to negotiate with the inevitable. "You create idols," Beerus continued, voice carrying effortlessly, "then panic when they attract attention." The sky darkened again, not with threat but with finality. "You have objected," Beerus said. "The objection is noted." He raised his hand. This time there was no pause. Energy gathered, not wild, not explosive, but absolute, the kind that did not escalate because it did not need to. The world felt it instantly, a deep, existential pressure that made knees buckle and thoughts scatter. "This is not punishment," Beerus said. "This is correction." The energy flared. Across the planet, Sup screamed as something fundamental shifted. Powers didn't vanish, but they collapsed inward, compressed into limits they could not exceed. Strength gained ceilings. Speed found friction. Regeneration slowed to human comprehension. Not destruction. Containment. The age of gods ended in a single moment of enforced humility. Homelander felt it too, whatever remnants of power still flickering inside him guttering and going dark. He sobbed openly now, no longer even pretending to understand what he'd lost. Beerus lowered his hand. "You may object," he said. "You may adapt, you may survive." He looked down at Homelander one last time. "But you will not pretend again." Above them, the sky cleared slightly, the pressure easing just enough for the world to breathe. The objection had failed. The verdict stood. And as Beerus turned away, attention already drifting toward larger questions, something else shifted, subtle, dangerous, and unresolved. Humanity had learned it could not stop a god. But it had also learned something else. Gods could leave. And what came after them would have to be faced alone. The world did not celebrate the failure of its objection. It reeled. In the minutes after the line collapsed, systems across the globe struggled to stabilize. Power returned unevenly. Communications reconnected in fragments. Emergency broadcasts resumed with no coherent message to deliver, looping reassurances that no one believed anymore. The sensation left behind by Beerus' correction lingered like a pressure change after a storm, subtle, disorienting, and impossible to ignore. Subs were the first to understand what had changed. Not because of announcements or data, but because their bodies betrayed them. Strength felt heavier, like lifting against resistance that hadn't been there before. Speed demanded effort. Regeneration slowed enough for pain to linger. The ceiling was real now, and it was lower than anyone wanted to admit. Across cities, capes stopped flying. Some subs tried anyway, launching into the air out of habit, only to falter, to drop clumsily back to rooftops and streets, hearts racing with a new, unfamiliar fear. They weren't weak, but they weren't untouchable either, and the difference mattered. Homelander lay where Beerus had left him. Emergency responders approached cautiously, not because they feared his power, but because they didn't know what he was anymore. Medics checked vitals, exchanged confused glances, and treated him like any other injured man. No handlers arrived. No Vought escorts cleared the street. When they loaded him onto a stretcher, no one clapped. Inside Vought Tower, or what remained of its operational core, the atmosphere was worse than panic. It was disbelief calcifying into understanding. Ashley Barrett stared at a wall of screens showing regional failures, soup status reports, and a stock ticker that had stopped moving entirely. "This isn't temporary," she said quietly. No one contradicted her. Vought's power had always rested on asymmetry, the ability to promise safety through beings no one else could challenge. That asymmetry was gone. Contracts were suddenly unenforceable. Non-disclosure agreements meant nothing when belief evaporated. Governments that had once negotiated now demanded audits, seizures, oversight. Vought had lost the narrative. The boys moved through the city like ghosts, watching people adjust in real time. Police officers took charge where SUPs once hovered. Firefighters entered zones that had been off-limits for years. Civilians argued loudly about accountability instead of hiding behind admiration. "It's not better," Huey said, watching a soup argue with a paramedic who refused to give him priority. "It's just different." Butcher nodded. "That's the point." Above it all, Beerus remained. Not hovering dramatically, not looming. Observing. He sat on a fragment of cloud that no longer drifted, legs crossed, chin resting in his palm, eyes half-lidded as he watched the planet adjust to its new limits. Wise stood beside him, staff glowing faintly as timelines stabilized and feedback loops settled into something survivable. "They're adapting faster than expected," Wise noted. Beerus hummed, "Fear accelerates learning." "But they're angry," Wise added. Beerus' tail flicked. "Anger is fine, worship was the problem." On the ground, anger took shape quickly. Protests erupted, not against Beerus, but against institutions that had enabled unchecked power for decades. Vought facilities were surrounded, then seized. Former executives were dragged before committees that didn't care how famous their lawyers were. SUPs who had once relied on PR teams found themselves answering questions without scripts. Some cooperated. Some fled. Some lashed out. Those didn't last long. With the ceiling enforced, violence had consequences again. Armed response units, once decorative, became effective. The balance shifted from spectacle to process, and process was unforgiving. Homelander woke up in a medical facility that smelled like antiseptic and finality. His first instinct was to sit up and demand answers. His body disagreed. Pain lanced through muscles that had never ached like this before. He groaned, collapsing back onto the bed, breath shallow and uneven. A nurse checked his chart without looking at him. "You're stable," she said flatly. "Don't move." Where's my team?" he asked hoarsely. The nurse paused, then looked at him, not with fear, not with awe, but with tired annoyance. "You don't have one," she replied. "Rest." She left. Homelander stared at the ceiling, the weight of that sentence pressing harder than any blow Beerus had delivered. He tried to feel his power, to summon even a spark of the certainty that had defined him. There was nothing. Just a man in a bed, listening to machines beep. Beerus felt that moment pass and dismissed it. The symbol had already fallen. What remained was maintenance. He rose from the cloud and drifted closer to the planet again, not threatening, not angry, simply present. His attention moved across regions, assessing the ripple effects of the correction. Some areas stabilized, others destabilized. That was expected. "What about them?" Wise asked, gesturing toward a cluster of sups gathered in a remote location, debating whether to organize. Beerus glanced once. "They may try, they will fail or adapt. And if they try to recreate the old order?" Beerus' expression flattened. "Then I will not be bored." The world felt that too, though no one could articulate it. Not fear of Beerus' return, but awareness that the rules were no longer flexible in the same way. There would be no savior arriving to reset the board, no god to absorb responsibility. Only consequences. By nightfall, cities were quieter than they'd been in years. Not peaceful, cautious. People locked doors, checked news updates, talked to neighbors they'd never bothered learning the names of. The absence of capes in the sky was unsettling but also clarifying. Danger didn't vanish. It redistributed. Beerus hovered one last time over Manhattan, eyes tracing the scars left behind by his arrival and judgment. Fires still burned. Crews still worked. The city breathed, unevenly but alive. "This will hurt," Wise said softly. Beerus nodded. "Growth often does." He turned away again, this time drifting farther, attention loosening its grip just enough for humanity to test itself without immediate oversight. Below, the world took its first uncertain steps into an age without gods it could hide behind. And far beneath that, in places Beerus had not yet bothered to look, resentment began to organize, quietly, patiently, waiting for a chance to prove that judgment without appeal could still be resisted. The first resistance did not announce itself with speeches or banners. It began with meetings held in basements, warehouses, and abandoned studios once used for sponsored hero interviews. Sups who had lost sponsorships, handlers, and legal insulation gathered around folding tables, arguing over what had happened and what it meant. Some were bruised, some were furious. All of them were afraid, even if none would admit it out loud. They weren't resisting Beerus. They were resisting irrelevance. For decades, power in this world had flowed in one direction. Sups acted. Institutions reacted. Civilians adapted. Beerus' judgment hadn't erased power, but it had redistributed responsibility, and that was intolerable to people who had never carried it before. A former speedster slammed his fist on the table, rattling coffee cups. He complained about response times, about police who no longer cleared streets for him, about crowds that looked at him like a problem instead of a miracle. Others nodded, murmuring agreement, feeding each other's grievances. None of them mentioned Homelander. The silence around his name was heavier than condemnation. Across the city, the boys tracked these gatherings with quiet efficiency. Frenchie monitored encrypted chatter. MM coordinated with contacts who suddenly answered calls they'd ignored for years. Huey compiled reports with a grim sense of déjà vu, watching familiar patterns reemerge in a world that swore it had learned its lesson. "They're not trying to take over," Huey said, scrolling through intercepted messages. "They're trying to matter." Butcher snorted, "Same thing, different pitch." What made it worse was that some of them had a point. Crime hadn't vanished. Disasters still happened. And while institutions were stepping up, they were slower, clumsier, human. People missed the simplicity of believing someone else could handle everything. That longing was dangerous. Beerus watched these developments with detached interest. He did not intervene when a soup-led neighborhood patrol crossed lines and assaulted a suspect on camera. He did not act when a group attempted to reclaim a shuttered Vought facility by force and were arrested without ceremony. These were not affronts to cosmic order. They were growing pains. This phase is predictable, Wise observed as they hovered above a continent still adjusting to its new limits. Power structures resist entropy. Beerus' eyes narrowed slightly. Entropy is not the problem, delusion is. The resistance reached a turning point when one of them made a mistake big enough to draw global attention. A mid-tier soup, formerly a headline regular, now barely tolerated, declared a safe zone in a coastal city, barricading streets and broadcasting a manifesto about restoring order. He framed it as protection. The footage showed intimidation. Civilians trapped between armed enforcement and a man who no longer understood restraint. Authorities surrounded the area but hesitated. The memory of God's falling was still fresh. Beerus noticed the hesitation immediately. He appeared above the safe zone without warning, floating just low enough to be seen by cameras and by the soup packing nervously below. The air pressure shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The soup looked up, face draining of color. Beerus did not speak at first. He simply waited, letting the moment stretch until the man's bravado collapsed into panic. When the soup finally shouted demands, recognition, negotiation, validation, Beerus sighed. "This is not resistance," Beerus said calmly. "This is noise." The soup launched an attack out of desperation. It didn't matter what form it took. Strength, speed, spectacle, it all failed the same way. Beerus flicked his wrist, and the man's powers vanished mid-motion, leaving him to crash painfully onto concrete as an ordinary body. Beerus did not erase him. That was the punishment. The world watched as authorities moved in, unopposed, to arrest a former god reduced to a man begging for relevance. The footage spread faster than anything Vought had ever produced, and it carried a message no press release could dilute. Judgment had layers. In a secure facility miles away, Homelander watched the same footage on a muted screen. He had been transferred out of the hospital quietly, stripped of celebrity access and placed under indefinite observation. The room was small. The walls were bare. The guards did not flinch when he raised his voice. Seeing Beerus again did something to him, not fear this time, recognition. He wasn't special in this new order. He wasn't even unique. That realization broke something deeper than pride. The boys saw the shift too. Resistance wasn't consolidating into an army or a coup. It was fracturing, exposed by a god who refused to dignify it with battle. Without spectacle, without the illusion of heroic conflict, the would-be revolutionaries collapsed under their own contradictions. "Funny thing," Butcher muttered, watching a replay of the arrest. "Turns out they didn't want power, they wanted permission." Beerus drifted away from the city once more, attention widening. He did not need to hunt every spark of defiance. Most would burn out on their own. A few would adapt. Those were the ones worth watching. The world felt heavier now, but clearer. Sups who remained active did so under scrutiny. Governments coordinated openly, no longer pretending superheroes were solutions instead of variables. People stopped looking to the sky when things went wrong. They looked at each other. Beerus considered that outcome acceptable. Still, something nagged at the edge of his awareness. Not a threat, not yet, but a pattern. Human systems adapting too quickly sometimes produced anomalies. Ideas hardened into movements, movements into dogma. Judgment created vacuums. Vacuum invited invention. Far below, in places untouched by Beerus' gaze, groups began discussing contingencies. Not to fight him, to outlast him, to plan for the day judgment moved on and left humanity alone with what it had learned or failed to. Beerus paused midair, eyes narrowing as if he'd heard a distant echo. "Interesting," he murmured. Wise smiled faintly, another lesson approaching. "Perhaps," Beerus replied, "or another disappointment." The planet continued turning beneath them, quieter than before, but not calmer. Resistance without gods had failed its first test. Something else was preparing to try again. Defiance did not end when the last would-be strongman was dragged away in cuffs. It learned. The weeks after Beerus' intervention produced a quieter, more dangerous response. No speeches, no barricades, no declarations of restored order. What emerged instead were networks, loose, deniable, deliberately unheroic. Former Vought contractors, disgraced researchers, mid-level sups who had survived the purge by keeping their heads down and their powers undocumented. They didn't talk about fighting Beerus. They talked about surviving him. In underground facilities and offshore platforms, people who had once believed power could be branded began asking different questions. Not how to beat a god, but how to function in a world where judgment could arrive without warning and without appeal. Their conclusions were messy, contradictory, and fueled by fear, but they shared a single assumption. Beerus would leave eventually. And when he did, whatever rules he enforced would weaken. The boys caught wind of it early, not through hero channels or government leaks, but through the same black market whispers they'd chased for years. Frenchie traced procurement orders for materials that didn't make sense in civilian hands. flagged shell companies repurposing abandoned Vought assets. Huey noticed the language shift, less about control, more about insulation. "They're building bunkers," Huey said, laying out the data. "Not physical ones, systems, redundancies, fail-safes." Butcher leaned back, unimpressed. "Always the same bloody mistake. You can't prep for judgment. You can only lie to yourself about it." The difference this time was scale. Governments weren't behind it. Corporations weren't front-facing. This wasn't a power grab. It was a hedge against accountability, designed by people who'd watched gods fall and decided they never wanted to be visible enough to be judged again. Beerus noticed the shift gradually, like background noise becoming rhythm. He did not object immediately. Fear-driven adaptation wasn't inherently offensive. Hiding was a human instinct, and not all instincts warranted correction. He watched networks form, dissolve, and reform under different names, their participants careful to avoid spectacle. "They think invisibility equals safety," Wise observed as they hovered above an ocean where nothing appeared to be happening. Beerus' expression was unreadable. "They think absence equals innocence." The cost of defiance revealed itself in a different way. Sups who had retained their abilities but lost their immunity began to fracture under pressure. Without handlers to rewrite narratives, every mistake mattered. Lawsuits followed collateral damage. Criminal charges stuck. Powers that once guaranteed dominance now guaranteed surveillance. Some adapted, they learned restraint, others snapped. A confrontation in a Midwest city escalated when a sup resisted arrest, convinced his past status would protect him. The standoff lasted minutes. He was subdued by conventional means, broadcast live, and sentenced within the week. No divine intervention followed. Beerus didn't appear. The absence was the lesson. In a detention center far from cameras, Homelander existed in a state that defied classification. Not imprisoned, not free. Not powerful, not powerless. Psych evaluations cycled endlessly, each one circling the same conclusion without stating it outright. He was no longer useful. When Beerus' name came up in conversation, Homelander didn't rage anymore. He didn't threaten. He went quiet, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow. The idea of worth had hollowed him out more effectively than any destruction could have. He was still alive. That was the cruelty. Beerus sensed him once distantly, like a collapsed star still exerting gravity without light. He chose not to look closer. The verdict had been delivered. Prolonging it would have been indulgent. The real cost surfaced when one of the hidden networks made its move. Not against Beerus, but against the world he'd reshaped. A coordinated blackout hit multiple cities simultaneously, exploiting vulnerabilities created during the post-judgment restructuring. Emergency services faltered. Communication grids collapsed. In the confusion, a group attempted to extract a classified asset, data tied to pre-Beerus contingency planning, designed to reintroduce controlled asymmetry if the opportunity ever arose. It was small, surgical, and it failed. Not because of Beerus, but because the world responded without him. Authorities coordinated across jurisdictions with a speed that would have been unthinkable months earlier. SUPs who had chosen adaptation assisted under supervision, their actions scrutinized in real time. Civilians followed protocols instead of panicking. The extraction team was intercepted, arrested, and exposed before sunrise. Beerus watched the aftermath in silence. "They're learning," Wise said. "Yes," Beerus replied, "and that makes the failures more expensive." The exposure had consequences. The existence of the networks became public knowledge, reframed not as resistance but as cowardice. The narrative flipped. Where once gods had been feared, now those who hid from judgment were. Trust eroded further. Funding dried up. Allies defected. The movement collapsed under the weight of its own secrecy, consumed by paranoia and betrayal. Beerus descended one final time, not to punish, but to observe the collapse up close. He stood at the edge of a city waking up after the blackout, watching crews restore systems with grim efficiency. No one looked up. They were too busy fixing what broke. That, more than any display of power, satisfied him. Still, the cost lingered. Infrastructure damage, lives disrupted, faith in permanence permanently shaken. The world would carry these scars forward, and not all of them would heal cleanly. Beerus turned away, attention drifting beyond the immediate crisis. "This phase is ending," he said. "The next will be clarifying." Wise inclined his head. "For them or for you?" Beerus paused, then smiled faintly. "For everyone." Far below, new conversations began, about limits, about oversight, about what kind of world could exist without the comforting lie of untouchable power. None of them were simple. All of them mattered. Judgment had imposed a cost. Now the bill was coming due. Judgment was never meant to be comfortable. The world learned that truth slowly, then all at once, as the consequences of Beerus' presence began reflecting inward rather than outward. Systems had stabilized. Resistance had collapsed. SUPs had adapted or faded. On the surface, the planet looked calmer than it had in years. Underneath, something else was happening. People were no longer asking whether Beerus would act again. They were asking whether they deserved it if he did. Governments convened emergency councils that never adjourned, not to plan an attack, that fantasy had died quickly, but to debate thresholds. What constituted unworthy behavior at a civilizational scale? What actions might draw attention again? No one knew. That uncertainty infected every decision, turning routine governance into an exercise in existential risk management. Beerus noticed the shift immediately. Fear had matured into self-examination. That wasn't the intended outcome, Wise observed as they drifted beyond the atmosphere, watching diplomatic signals spike across continents. "They're internalizing your criteria." Beerus' expression tightened slightly. "They're guessing," he corrected. "That is different." "But they're changing behavior." "Yes," Beerus said, "because they are afraid of being seen." That was the problem. Judgment was meant to expose truth, not suppress it. A world that hid itself too well became stagnant, dishonest in a new way. Beerus watched leaders hesitate, delay relief efforts, suppress information, not out of malice, but out of fear that visibility itself invited condemnation. The irony did not amuse him. On the ground, the boys felt the shift from a different angle. Transparency laws were passed overnight, then quietly undermined by agencies terrified of public mistakes. SUPs were regulated, but so were journalists. Whistleblowers found themselves protected on paper and isolated in practice. "This is backwards," Huey said, reading a classified brief that somehow hadn't stayed classified. "They're not hiding power anymore. They're hiding failure." Butcher scowled. That's what happens when people think a god's watching. They stop being honest, start being careful. The breaking point came quietly. A humanitarian crisis unfolded in a developing region after infrastructure failures compounded with environmental stress. Aid was delayed, not because resources were unavailable, but because no one wanted to authorize an operation that might draw Beerus' attention if it went wrong. People died waiting. Beerus felt it like grit under his skin. He did not appear immediately. He watched. He listened. He observed the rationalizations forming in real time, excuses layered atop fear, bureaucracy weaponized by uncertainty. This wasn't defiance. It was paralysis. Wise spoke carefully. They believe restraint will spare them. Beerus' eyes narrowed. They believe judgment is arbitrary. It is. Beerus was silent for a long moment. When he moved, it wasn't dramatic. He didn't descend in fire or light. He simply appeared in the middle of a council chamber where representatives were debating language instead of logistics. Conversations died mid-sentence as the air pressure shifted. No one screamed. They had learned better than that. Beerus looked around the table unimpressed. "You misunderstand the lesson," he said calmly. "Judgment is not punishment for error. It is consequence for dishonesty." One official stammered an apology. Another tried to explain constraints. Beerus raised a finger and the room fell silent. "You delayed action to avoid blame," he continued. "You allowed fear of being seen to outweigh responsibility. That is unworthy." The word hit harder than any explosion. Beerus did not erase them. He did not destroy the building. Instead, he did something worse. He removed their authority. Not metaphorically. Reality bent, subtly and decisively, as decision-making power shifted away from the room entirely. Systems rerouted. Emergency protocols activated without their input. Orders bypassed chains of command that had existed for generations. The council members sat there, still alive, still conscious and suddenly irrelevant. Aid moved within minutes. Across the world, similar shifts occurred. Centralized authority weakened as distributed systems took precedence, not because Beerus favored democracy, but because opacity had proven itself unworthy of stewardship. He left without another word. The aftermath was chaos, but productive chaos. Institutions scrambled to redefine roles. Leaders resigned preemptively. Others adapted, embracing transparency not as virtue but necessity. The world didn't become kinder. It became more honest. Homelander watched the footage of the council's humiliation from his facility, something stirring behind his eyes. Not hope, not anger. Recognition. He had done the same thing over and over, avoided truth, performed strength, punished exposure. The difference was scale. Beerus hadn't judged him for failing to protect the world. He judged him for lying about why he wanted to. That understanding landed late and uselessly. Beerus did not return to check on him. Instead, he hovered once more above the planet, attention broader now, less forgiving. The world had passed one test and failed another. That was acceptable. Growth was iterative. But something else had changed. The world was no longer merely reacting to judgment. It was beginning to question it. Not in defiance, but in inquiry. Philosophers, theologians, scientists, all asking the same dangerous question from different angles. If worth could be assessed externally, what did that mean for autonomy? If judgment enforced honesty, who judged the judge? Beerus felt those questions brush against him like static. For the first time since his arrival, he frowned. "Careful," Wise said gently. "They're turning inward." "Yes," Beerus replied, "and inward is where meaning either solidifies or fractures." He didn't move away this time. He stayed. The world looked back at its judge, not with worship or fear alone, but with something more volatile. Expectation. Expectation is heavier than fear. Fear scatters. Expectation concentrates. And as the world began to look toward Beerus not just as a judge, but as a reference point, the pressure changed shape. It stopped pushing people away from mistakes and started pulling them toward certainty, toward answers no God should be expected to give. Beerus felt it everywhere. In the way emergency councils waited before acting, as if pausing might invite correction. In the way protests framed their demands not around policy, but around worth. In the way leaders spoke carefully, less to one another than to the sky, choosing language that sounded honest instead of being honest. Judgment had become a gravity well. Wise watched the pattern form with quiet concern. "They're externalizing responsibility again," he said, "just differently." Beerus' ears twitched. "They are outsourcing meaning." The cost appeared in subtle places first. A city delayed evacuation during a natural disaster because officials argued publicly about whether intervention would be seen as overreach. A research team halted a promising medical trial after internal debate about whether altering human limits might attract divine scrutiny. Teachers avoided difficult conversations, parents avoided discipline, and institutions avoided decisions that could be misinterpreted. No one wanted to be unworthy, and no one agreed on what worthy meant. The boys felt it too, though they lacked the language for it. Their work had become easier in some ways. Corruption was harder to hide, but harder in others. Everyone was scared of being wrong, and fear made people defensive. "This isn't accountability," MM said after a meeting with regulators stalled for the third time in a week. "It's paralysis." Butcher exhaled smoke and stared out a cracked window. That's what happens when the bloke with the biggest stick never tells you where the line is. Beerus heard that sentiment echoed across the planet, translated into 1,000 cultures and complaints. He had never promised clarity. He had never offered guidance, but absence of explanation had become its own influence. For the first time, Beerus considered whether presence itself had become distortion. He descended again, not to punish, not to correct, but to observe more closely. He walked among humans unnoticed, masking his aura enough to pass as a stranger in crowded streets. He watched people argue, hesitate, second-guess. He listened to conversations that circled the same question without daring to name it. What do we do now? In a small auditorium, a public forum devolved into shouting as speakers accused one another of courting judgment or ignoring it. No one talked about outcomes anymore. Only optics, only worth. Beerus left before the meeting ended. Elsewhere, Homelander reached a breaking point of his own. Months of confinement had stripped away the last scaffolding of performance. No interviews, no missions, no applause. The evaluations had shifted from assessing his usefulness to documenting his deterioration. He was no longer a variable to manage. He was a case study. When Beerus' name came up during a session, Homelander laughed quietly, bitterly. "You think he cares," he muttered. "He already decided." The doctor didn't respond. That silence hurt more than any reprimand. Beerus sensed Homelander's state dimly, like background radiation from a collapsed reactor. He did not intervene. The punishment had not been physical. It had been categorical. To reverse it would cheapen the verdict. The real problem was broader. The world had begun treating Beerus, judgment, as law. Not metaphorical law, structural law. Policies referenced existential thresholds. Charters included clauses about demonstrable worth. Entire bureaucracies reoriented toward avoiding attention rather than solving problems. Beerus watched one such policy meeting dissolve into argument over semantics and felt something unfamiliar. Irritation. Not at defiance, not at arrogance. At misinterpretation. Wise noticed immediately, "You are considering correction." "Yes," Beerus said, "but not destruction." "Then what?" Beerus looked at the planet, spinning with careful anxiety beneath them. A reminder. The reminder came without spectacle. Beerus appeared in the sky, not over a city, not over a battlefield, but visible everywhere at once. Not as a giant, not as a terror. Simply present, his image carried across screens that activated on their own, broadcasts overriding feeds without damaging them. He spoke once. "Judgment is not governance," Beerus said, voice calm and absolute. "It does not replace choice. It does not absolve responsibility. If you act only to avoid being seen, you have already failed." The message lasted seconds. Then he vanished. The effect was immediate and uneven. Some governments seized the moment, pushing through long-stalled reforms under the banner of reclaimed autonomy. Others doubled down, insisting interpretation still mattered. Social movements fractured, some relieved, others angry that certainty had been denied. Beerus had removed himself as reference, and that terrified people more than his presence ever had. Without a visible judge, the world had to decide whether it had actually learned anything. The boys watched the fallout with wary optimism. "He just told them to grow up," Huey said. "No safety net." Butcher nodded, "And now we find out who was pretending." Yet even as Beerus pulled back, the pressure didn't fully dissipate. Something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone by clarification alone. Ideas of worth and judgment had taken root, reshaping cultures and conflicts. Some groups began using the language of worth to justify exclusion. Others weaponized transparency, turning every mistake into a referendum. The absence of divine oversight didn't erase the framework Beerus had imposed. It fossilized it. Beerus sensed the crystallization and frowned. He had intended to expose lies. He might have created a new one. High above the planet, he paused, attention narrowing, not to humanity as a whole, but to a specific convergence of thought, leaders, thinkers, and opportunists quietly aligning around a dangerous premise. If worth could be judged, then it could be defined. And if it could be defined, it could be enforced. Beerus' eyes narrowed, tail flicking with restrained annoyance. "Ah," he murmured, "there it is." Below, unseen and uncelebrated, a new doctrine began to form, one that did not fear judgment but sought to replace it. The lie did not arrive loudly. It arrived packaged as reassurance. After months of uncertainty, debates, and paralysis, the world was desperate for something solid, something it could point to and say, "This is the rule now." Into that void stepped people who understood systems better than morality. Think tanks, security councils, technocrats, and former Vought architects who had survived by reinventing themselves faster than the world could track. They didn't call it judgment. They called it standardization. The doctrine spread through white papers, emergency summits, and policy proposals that promised stability without superstition. If Beerus judged worth arbitrarily, they argued humanity could do better by defining worth collectively. Metrics replaced mystery. Thresholds replaced discretion. Transparency replaced uncertainty, at least on paper. Beerus noticed the shift immediately. This wasn't fear reacting to him. This was imitation. "They are building a god," Wise observed as data streams lit up around them, "one they believe they can audit." Beerus' expression darkened. They are building a shield. The doctrine gained traction quickly because it offered comfort. Subs were reclassified not as individuals, but as risk categories. Entire populations were assessed based on projected stability contribution. Governments began adopting unified worth indices, claiming it would prevent another Homelander before one could rise. It sounded responsible. It was. The first casualties weren't famous. They were quiet removals. People denied resources, mobility, or agency because an algorithm flagged them as statistically volatile. No executions, no camps, just doors that stopped opening, systems that refused to respond. The boys watched it unfold with growing alarm. "This is Vought with better branding," Huey said, scrolling through leaked documentation. "They've turned judgment into math." Butcher's jaw tightened. "Worse, math doesn't feel guilty." Beerus descended again, not in anger but in recognition. This was not defiance of his authority, it was replacement. He appeared in the middle of a global summit unveiling the framework, materializing beside a holographic display of projected social equilibrium. Leaders froze mid-sentence. Security teams stood down instinctively, knowing better than to escalate. Beerus studied the display with mild curiosity. "You misunderstand something fundamental," he said calmly. "Worth is not a resource to be allocated." A representative tried to respond carefully, respectfully, arguing that the system reduced harm, that it prevented extremes, that it removed ego from power. Beerus listened without interruption. Then he raised a finger. The hologram shattered. Not explosively, cleanly. Every projection, every model, every linked system collapsed into inert light. Servers across the globe failed simultaneously, their data rendered meaningless by a correction so precise it left no trace to rebuild from. Beerus looked at the room. "You have replaced gods with procedure," he continued, "and called it progress. That is unworthy." This time, the punishment was structural. He did not erase the architects. He erased the doctrine's foundation. The indices stopped working. The enforcement mechanisms lost authority. The classifications reverted overnight, leaving governments scrambling as systems they had come to rely on simply refused to function. The world felt the shock immediately. Markets froze. Borders hesitated. Entire administrations realized they had surrendered decision-making to something that no longer existed. Chaos followed, not violent but bureaucratic, cascading through layers of dependency. Beerus left them in it. Homelander felt the collapse like an echo of his own undoing. Watching the summit feed end abruptly, he finally understood the pattern. Beerus didn't destroy power. He destroyed lies about power. And the biggest lie of all was that worth could be engineered. The boys moved fast, exploiting the vacuum to expose what the doctrine had already done. Names surfaced. Policies were repealed in panic. Protests erupted, not demanding gods but demanding humanity reclaim agency from systems that had promised safety without accountability. Beerus watched from afar, satisfaction muted by caution. This was the edge. If the world failed here, it would regress, not into worship, but into control so rigid it would require another correction. And Beerus was not interested in becoming a maintenance god. Wise spoke quietly, "They are close to learning." "Or close to choosing comfort again," Beerus replied. Below, leaders stood before cameras without scripts, admitting uncertainty for the first time in generations. Some were honest, others weren't. The difference mattered now. The doctrine lay in ruins, but the impulse that created it remained. The world had one final chance to decide what judgment meant when no god enforced it. Beerus hovered at the edge of perception, waiting. If humanity could not govern itself without inventing new gods, then perhaps it did not deserve to be governed at all. The world did not receive a final speech. There was no proclamation etched into the sky, no thunderous announcement declaring victory or failure. What came instead was absence, deliberate, unmistakable, and permanent in its implications. When people looked up and realized that Beerus was no longer present, the relief they expected never arrived. Only responsibility did. In the days following the collapse of the doctrine, governments moved without waiting for signs. Emergency powers were relinquished as quickly as they had been claimed. Oversight committees were restructured with teeth instead of slogans. Transparency laws were rewritten to protect truth rather than punish exposure. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to matter. The world stopped asking what Beerus would think. It started asking what it could live with. That shift marked the true end of the age of gods. Subs were no longer a category above consequence. Licensing replaced celebrity. Training replaced branding. Those who adapted remained visible, accountable, and limited. Those who didn't quietly disappeared from relevance, not erased by divine hand, but by public refusal to believe in them anymore. Vought International did not survive in any recognizable form. Assets were dismantled, seized, or nationalized under frameworks that explicitly forbade myth-making. The name lingered only in court documents and documentaries, a case study in how power collapsed once stripped of narrative immunity. The corporation that once sold gods ended up remembered as a warning. The boys watched it all unfold from the margins. Billy Butcher never smiled about it. Huey never celebrated. None of them mistook this for justice in the way they once imagined. Too many people had suffered for that illusion to hold. But the system they'd spent their lives fighting no longer existed, and that counted for something. "World's not fixed," Huey said one night, watching a city council meeting stream live without spin. "But it's not pretending anymore." Butcher nodded once. "That's as good as it gets." In a secure facility that no longer bothered to hide its location, Homelander faced his final reckoning, not from a god, not from a mob, but from obscurity. Evaluation ceased. Interviews ended. The world stopped asking what he thought. He was alive, healthy, power intact in ways that no longer mattered. When news feeds mentioned him at all, it was in the past tense. Beerus sensed that outcome from afar and found it sufficient. He had not come to rule. He had not come to save. He had come to judge worth where power had mistaken itself for virtue. The verdict did not require his continued presence to stand. From beyond the reach of satellites and summoning rituals, Beerus looked once more at the planet, not with fondness, not with disdain, with closure. "They will fail again," Wise said gently. "Yes," Beerus replied, "but they will fail as themselves." That distinction mattered. He turned away then, presence folding inward without spectacle. No shockwave marked his departure. No void opened in his wake. The universe simply resumed its quiet indifference, as if testing whether humanity could now do the same. On Earth, people felt the moment without understanding it. The sky seemed ordinary again, the air lighter. The sense of being watched faded, not replaced by safety but by accountability. Children stopped asking which heroes would save them. They asked what rules meant. Adults stopped waiting for permission to act. The verdict had not been destruction. It had been exposure. Power without worth had been stripped of its mask. Judgment without governance had forced humanity to choose whether it wanted to grow or hide behind new lies. The choice was ongoing, permanent, uncomfortable, and entirely theirs. Somewhere beyond judgment and beyond care, Beerus moved on, leaving behind a world that would never again confuse strength with value or survival with virtue. The gods were gone. The verdict remained.